This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Question 2B talks about categorisation. It means that making the decision that some segments of speech are voiced, some segments of speech are not voiced. That categorisation. Each segment in one of those fields. No, it's just start writing. Grab your pens, make sure you put the student number only, please, on the front to start with, and you've got 30 minutes, which I think is easily achievable. Other stuff, phones, watches, whatever, should be well made and bagged correctly. Okay, can you put your pens down, please? So, do the usual thing, same as we did last time. Take a break, and we're going to start the lecture around 6. Right, let's get started again. I think if it's okay with you, I'll just push on and we'll finish about 8 with just the one break. And the topic I wanted to move on to tonight, I've called About the Content. I'm not sure if that's a great name, but it was the best I could come up with. But because what I'm wanting to do now is... sorry, this is distracting. We've looked at dealing with the content itself, how to compress the audio, how to compress the video, issues of streaming it and so on. But to provide a full multimedia service, particularly an interactive service, probably think of Netflix as we go through here, because it's probably the best model that we could think about. There are other things that we need that are dependent on the what's inside the content. So metadata, you've probably come across that term before, is describing what the data actually is, so what the multimedia content actually is. And the other part that I want to talk about tonight is digital rights management, which is the set of tools that are used to protect against piracy, which is a major issue for multimedia. So, what's metadata? The term metadata, the word metadata means data about data. By the way, I'm not using the lapel mic because it wasn't put back in and so it hasn't been charged properly. So I hope the desk microphone is picking me up well enough if anyone needs the recording. So what's metadata? What's multimedia metadata? It's associated with the media and it's telling us something about what's inside, and it comes in a couple of different categories. So partly it's technical, so the parameters that you would need to be able to decode the data file, so things like sampling rate, color space used, what's the format, is it H.264, is it H.265. There's also data that's associated with the piece of content that isn't necessarily about the format, but useful production information, such as when it was captured, location, these sorts of things. And then there's information about the content itself. So the first is the technical description of it, but then what's inside it. So we could have some sort of structured, high-level information about it. A film is a good example to use, where you might have things like the title, the director, the composer, the actors in the movie and so on, and probably some unique ID so that you can always uniquely identify it. There could be less structured information, such as a synopsis or a thumbnail image to use when putting in a sort of library presentation. And we could have low-level descriptions of the particular piece of content. Talking very generally, there could be descriptions of the objects that are inside in the case of music, what the tempo is, what the key is, some sort of temporal information about changes that occur, and that could be used to identify or match that content. Well, we'll come back to how we could use that a little bit later. As well as the description about all of that is about the content, so it's technical description and also what it's all about. But we also require, or may require, metadata that describes what we're allowed to do with it, or how we can do it. So there could be classification. Is it G-rated? Is it PG? Is it MA? Whatever. And there could be information about what we're allowed to do with it. So are we allowed to make a copy of it? Are we only allowed to play it during particular dates? Are we only allowed to play it a particular number of times? So what it means is that for a particular piece of content, and I'm using something fairly topical at the moment, we've got our Avengers Endgame movie, and associated with that movie in some way is information about the content and about its use. Right? So we've got the description of what's in it, but also information about how it can be used. And you can imagine if we've got that information associated in some way with our piece of content, then we can automate the whole process of ingesting, is the term that's used, ingesting the piece of content into our system, encoding it and making it available at the right date, at the right time, with the necessary restrictions, and having the information that can allow our customers to find the piece of content that we want. When I say associate, this information is associated with the content, it doesn't necessarily mean it's in the same file. There could be some links via a URL or something similar. So I kind of alluded to why we actually have the metadata, but it can assist us to identify a piece of content. It can help us track it. So there could be a number of components that need to be put together to put into some final produced work, and so we can keep track of that through the production process. If the piece of data is archived into some database, made available for retrieval, we need to be able to find it. We need to be able to find it on several bases. Right? We might not always have the title. We might want everything from that publisher, or all movies by that director, or whatever. And that is associated with discovery. So discovery is the general term given to people trying to find a piece of content. So it might be via a search, but it could be by recommendation. So Netflix says, because you watch this, you might be interested in that. And generally, to be able to commercialise, make money out of it, basically. The requirements of the metadata could differ throughout the delivery chain. So, for instance, we might get let's go with the example of ingesting this movie into the Netflix system. We might get a very high quality version of this from the production company. I can't remember who does Marvel. I can't remember. Anyway, whatever. The film company might give us a 4K version, 444 sampled, very high bit rate, might be on a disc, and we would need to know all that about that format as we take that content into our system, but then we would transcode it. Transcode means not just encode, but take it from one encoding format to another encoding format. And we might want all sorts of information when we first ingest this from the film studio about what's in it, all the details about the production, maybe even the components that are used. But we might not necessarily make all of that available to our customers because they don't necessarily need it to be able to find a piece of content. So by the time this is re-encoded, put on our servers and available for retrieval, the metadata may well have changed. Just the fact that we have encoded it at a different rate with a different encoder, probably, is enough to have changed the metadata, but also what we provide for our users to be able to search and find the content may be different to what comes from the movie studio. And we wouldn't necessarily pass on to the user the price that we paid them, for instance. So there are different applications for different applications require different metadata. Just in terms of the terminology that's used in this area, we refer to the actual content itself as the essence, and to which the metadata is attached. So a piece of content, particularly in like a multimedia on-demand type system, would refer to both of those components: the essence itself and the metadata. So where do we get all this metadata from? Some of it can be automatically generated, and some of it we need to try to extract, and some of it we might have to actually manually put in. So let's say let's talk as generally as we can. A piece of content is generated by some sort of production process. So this generates the essence, right? This is the actual video or the actual audio. And then there's several possible sources of metadata. So one of them is the source itself. So since we're producing say the video clip, obviously the system components that are used to edit it already know what the resolution is, they know what the color space is, they will encode it in a particular format and provide that information. So that low-level stuff can be automatically provided from the way it was generated. We may be able to take this essence and analyze it in some way. So we've got some interpretation of what is in that piece of that actual piece of audio or video, and the automated systems to do this are becoming more and more sophisticated. We're just at an interesting time, I think, when, as you're aware from common usage, the automated systems to interpret what is spoken in an audio clip, or to recognise faces and potentially recognise the owner of the face, is enabling more and more of this type of analysis. We're not quite at the stage where we can say, just go and find me a clip that has Arnold Schwarzenegger in it, and it'll find them all, but it's not far away. But the sort of thing that we could analyse reasonably reliably are the low-level descriptions. So we could detect that it's an animated movie rather than a live action movie. We can categorise it in terms of identifying where the keyframes are. We can identify all the eye pictures, for instance, and we can do some extract some features that we can use that are hopefully uniquely associated with this piece of content. Things like colour histograms and spectrograms and things. We'll come back to that a little later. An example of being able to interpret or analyse something of the essence and be able to use that to identify what that essence is being able to characterise the audio content of a musical track, and then go to a database like GraceNote. So I think I've got this on the graphic. So when you import a music track into iTunes, for instance, it will do some analysis, go away to this GraceNote database and identify what the track is, even if you didn't provide it, or it wasn't ripped from a CD. It would still be able to analyse the music. And then, depending on the application and whether someone's willing to spend the money on it, we may have metadata that is manually annotated. So that means we have to employ someone to look at say the news clip that's broadcast on TV, type in it what's happening in each scene, and that allows the TV station or production house to archive all of that material and be able to get it back at some later time if they need to. So, how much can we extract from our essence? The technical parameters give us these sorts of things. Analysis can give us, as I mentioned, what it won't tell us the actual content in terms of interpreting what's inside our piece of multimedia. It won't tell us who's speaking. It won't tell us what's in the scene, in that we won't be able to tell, this is a beach scene and there's an island and there's a palm tree, but we can characterise the media with different parameters, such as the spectrograms and what's the dominant colour and so on. What we might want to know is much higher level. So the Arnold Schwarzenegger example, I might want all the movies with Arnold Schwarzenegger, or might want that movie that has Arnold Schwarzenegger playing the part of a robot, something about time travel, right? It's hard to get an automated system to interpret a movie and extract all that sort of information. And that's what's called the semantic gap. Yeah.
I was just wondering, how do companies like YouTube flag copyrighted content from video? Is that through the analysis? Or is that
Yeah, really good question. We're actually going to come to that a little bit later. Yeah. And oh, you mean like the audio track or the video track?
Yeah, like if you, I don't know, ripped a scene from a DVD or Blu-ray and uploaded it onto YouTube,
Yeah.
automatically detects that, you know, it's owned by Warner Brothers or whatever, and then puts
Yeah.
ads on your video so that they profit from it.
Yep. So that's a technique called fingerprinting. It extracts a fingerprint and compares that with a database. But we're going to get onto that later in this lecture. So the semantic gap is the gap between what we can easily automatically extract from a piece of content and the actual knowledge that we might want. The semantics is the interpretation. But increasingly, we're getting there. Right? As I said, we kind of live in interesting times in that face recognition systems are becoming much more sophisticated. Speech recognition systems are becoming much more sophisticated. And speaker recognition is becoming much more sophisticated. So increasingly, we're closing that gap. I'm not sure that we'll go all the way very soon. I wouldn't like to make predictions in that space, but it's interesting the developments that are occurring. So what are the applications that can utilise metadata? We can obviously use metadata to identify a piece of multimedia. So Shazam extracts an audio fingerprint and uses it to help you identify a music track, but the same technique is used by something like YouTube to identify that music track that you put on top of your home video clip is actually copyrighted and you don't have the authority to use it. You can now search for lyrics in Apple Music, for instance. That raises an interesting question as to whether song lyrics are part of the essence or part of the metadata. I think it depends on how they're used. If you like to watch the lyrics as they come up while you're listening to a song, then I guess it's part of the essence. If you use it as part of your search, then it's metadata. So I think they can have either role. And there are applications that are, in some sense, a bit more sophisticated than Shazam, not just able to recognise a particular recording of a musical track, but be able to identify it from someone humming or singing it. So they're able to, it's possible to extract the rhythms, the tempos, the harmonic components and try to match it to a database. So that would be trying to identify a particular piece of multimedia. So how can I identify that this is that particular song? Another thing you might be interested in is just similarity. So this metadata that's associated with your multimedia content could be compared with others, and that would allow you to do things like find music that's similar to something that you've just listened to, or would allow Netflix or iTunes to say, well, you because you watched this particular movie, you may also like another. There's a facility in Google. It's not that well known, I don't think, because it's not phenomenally successful, but it's available to look for similar images. So if you have a particular image that you found as a result of a Google search, you can search for similar images, and it will try to find other images that have a similar sort of color content or a similar kind of structure or something like that. And there's a general area of searching an image database by the content rather than by a text string, which is called query by image content. I'll show you an example of that in just a second. Where else can we use metadata? Well, obviously if we want to archive multimedia content and be able to find it later, then we need this metadata. So journalists doing searching in the archives for other recordings of a particular person or an event or something will be relying on metadata, and that's an interesting application from the point of view that some event may not become significant until well after the recording or the archiving. So there might be a recording of what's an example? Say with the election later this month, if Bill Shorten becomes elected as Prime Minister, he's all of a sudden more important, and so there might be some recording of something that he was involved in with the trade union many years ago, which may not have been significant news at the time, but journalists may want to be able to find that that later on, which is why in the news production application they go to the trouble of employing people that will do this. They literally type that this person and this person was in the scene, and this is where they were, and this is why they were there. And it might be years later that a particular meeting or a particular recording becomes important. We can use metadata also for data sorting, so to be able to personalise news. If I express an interest in news of a particular type, like some sports team or something like that, then having the metadata associated with the multimedia allows you to filter and sort like that. And surveillance is another application for metadata. If I can detect that something about what's happening inside the piece of content, then I can detect that someone's where they shouldn't be, or I could even potentially, with a sophisticated surveillance system, track a person and see that they see as they move from one camera's view to another. It's worth noting, just on the side, physically on the side as well, that the interpretation of metadata is sometimes by human, but not always by human. So examples are given there. So if I want to search through the Netflix database to find all the comedy movies, then that's me interpreting that metadata and using that metadata. But it could be by automated software process. So a personal video recorder, for instance, I can set up to record all programs of a particular type, and I won't necessarily be monitoring that metadata all the time, but it will be checking and making decisions about what it should record for me. And that matching of content fingerprints is also an example where you have a software system that's continually monitoring stuff that people upload to YouTube and making decisions about whether it matches or not. Okay, so I mentioned similarity here, and this is an interesting topic in itself, because it isn't necessarily clear in the case of multimedia what similarity means, and I think this is maybe slightly artificial, but I think it illustrates the point quite well. If I wanted to find flags that were similar on the basis of the spatial edges, then I'd group all of these together, of course, because they each are based on these three stripes. But maybe similarity should be on the basis of colours. So these ones would be the ones that would be I would match in a similar way. If it if I was taking account of the colours and their distribution, then I would match these ones, even though there's no star in here. The distribution of colours is similar. But if I looked at the object shape, then I'd say, oh, there's a star here and a star here, so these ones are similar. So the point, I think, is obvious that we use this term similar, and in fact even multimedia services use the term that these music tracks are similar, for instance, but there are lots of bases on which you would make that decision. So in the movie application, if a recommendation engine suggests similar movies for me, then are they action movies, or are they sci-fi movies, or are they British movies? Why? Which are the ones that will be chosen? Okay, and similarly in the music case, is similar music completely defined by beats per minute, or is it more complicated? Here's an example of a query by image content system, which isn't actually available anymore. It used to be, it was a collaboration between IBM and the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. It was interesting because you could go into the art collection, the online art collection, and describe the pieces of art that you'd like to see on the basis not of exactly what they look like, but in some sort of a descriptor, or using some sort of a descriptor. So for instance, with colours, you see the interface here, we can say of the total percentage, we want about, about 25% red and about 25% blue and a little bit of yellow. Go away and find all the artworks that are that match that. And the search results in this case came back like this when I tried this many years ago, and then not, partly successful, I guess, but some of the results are a little bit surprising. So the accuracy of the results aren't so important, I think, as just the fact that that it allowed that sort of interface. So we're trying to say that we're looking for artworks based on the proportion of certain colours anywhere distributed in the picture. The other facility this enabled was the colour and shape. So with this interface, with some very simple drawing tools, you could pick a colour, say the bottom part of the picture should be green and the top part of the picture then blue. Had in mind it should be possible to get some sort of a landscape with blue sky and green grass or something like that, and it goes away and tries to find that. The results were not so impressive again, but as I say, it's the move towards this query not on the basis of the name of the artwork, but how can I describe it in colour terms or shape terms, that I think was interesting. Okay, we've said that we've got all this metadata that we would like to associate with a piece of content, but how do we organise it? Maybe the obvious thing to do would be just to define the file, and we can put all the fields that we can possibly think of in this file, and then associate that with our piece of content. But the problem we'll have is that there will be a lot of fields. If we think about all the different multimedia applications, audio and video and image, and not just the final distribution of audio, video or image, but perhaps in the production process, then there will be a lot of fields, and many of them might not be used in all situations. And we need to make some sort of a decision about how many bytes we assign to each of those fields. And we want to make it future-proof, of course. And do we want the same metadata format for, meaning the format of the metadata file, for different types of media? Will it work for audio and image and subtitles and whatever else? And how do we handle media when they're combined together? So if we have some metadata that describes video and some metadata that describes audio, and we edit them all together into some final piece of video that combines the two and has subtitles as well, how do we handle the subtitles? And then what happens if further down the track we find something new comes along and we want to add a field in there? Then we have a compatibility issue with all the old content. No one ever thought of 3D video or something similar. And there are also different metadata that are used for different purposes. So let's just think of still images as an example. Obviously, the end consumer might have some metadata requirements just to know that it's JPEG and know the resolution, and maybe there's a location that we would want to have associated with the photos we take. But the metadata that's used when you render it to an output device, so try to get the colours accurate when you print a photo would be different. There would be different metadata associated with trying to sell photos, and news organisations would have different archiving and library type requirements. A museum might have different requirements as well. Then there are copyright issues. So is it practical to solve those with one metadata system? Well, in fact, if we look at the metadata systems that are used just for images, there are lots of them. Here's a list. That's not exhaustive either. The only one in there that is probably familiar to you would be EXIF, right, which is inserted in pretty much any JPEG photo that you take. We'll come back to EXIF. But there are all these other ones that come from different industries, like the sales and advertising purposes, and a system that's was developed by libraries and so on. So this metadata, this diverse requirements for metadata and the diverse origins of metadata is proving a bit of a problem if we are thinking to somehow unify and consolidate them. EXIF is an example of a fixed file format that I described earlier. So you probably come across it and you're aware that it's used by digital cameras. So along with the actual JPEG image, pretty much any JPEG image will have this EXIF file associated with it, and there'll be a little thumbnail version of the image, and there'll be data associated with it, number of pixels, the date captured, and stuff like that. It's bound with the image, and it's got fixed fields and assigned word lengths, as I was suggesting before. And as a result, it's caused some pain over the years, because, for instance, EXIF can't accommodate video. So when EXIF was developed by a group of Japanese camera manufacturers, a still image camera was used to take still images, but not videos. So there is no facility in the EXIF formats to accommodate the video that today you can take with a camera. Pictures have to be JPEG or TIFF. They can't accommodate RAW. So if you're a keen photographer, you might be familiar with the RAW format. So this is before it's compressed in any way. It's just the quantized output from each of the RGB sensors at each pixel location. So you can do all the optimization in software. But the Nikon RAW format is different to the Canon RAW format, and and the only way you are able to edit a RAW format is if Adobe, for instance, modifies Photoshop to accommodate your format. It's not something that can be carried within EXIF in any sort of a standardized portable format. The bit depth of modern DSLRs is greater than can be accommodated by EXIF. I'm not sure, I can't remember what the range is. Of course, we've talked about using 8-bit digitization of pixels, but modern DSLRs go much beyond that to something like 14-bit or so. And so those sorts of developments need to be accommodated. While time has always been a supported field, so time of day at which you took the photo, the time zone was not, and it's only by a reasonably recent change or revision of this EXIF file that they allowed for what's called a time offset. Just to complete the picture of how metadata is organised in JPEG images, it actually sits in 3 different places. So JPEG itself has a header that includes the information that you need to be able to decode the image. So that makes sense because you've got to be able to know what the image dimensions are, for instance, to be able to interpret the data. Then there's this EXIF data that's actually inside a field of the JPEG file. So that includes things like time and date, the type of camera, the ISO setting, the shutter time, and so on. And then there's additional facility to put proprietary data. So if Canon decides that there's other stuff that they'd like to include, like the camera lens or particular camera settings or something like that, then they can put it in a proprietary field. So it's and particularly because some of that stuff that they wanted to include is not accommodated within EXIF. So all of that, those last 2 slides, is to illustrate the challenges of coming up with a defined set of metadata parameters and the size of data that should be used to describe them. And it's one of the reasons why the recent trend over the last few years has been towards XML as a way of representing metadata. So what's XML? XML, if you haven't come across it before, is a little bit like HTML, except where HTML defines how to present data on a web page. So it says this is how you this is the font and the color to use for a particular text and so on. XML is a structured way of representing data, so you know how to or what type of data we have. And so this is a very simple illustration of XML that I extracted from that web page if you're interested to pursue it a bit further. But it just shows that we can represent a letter as an XML document by defining the text of the letter, but also defining the address in this way, such that we see the start of the city field, end of the city field, but it's flexible. It's not. We haven't got a fixed number of bytes that are used to represent it, and it's not just text that we can search. Or sorry, it's more sophisticated than just searching text. For instance, if we wanted to, if we didn't have this structured representation, so we knew that the name of the person was Mr. John Smith, but instead we were just doing searches based on plain text, then we could search for Smith, and it might be part of the street name, or it could even be part of the location, or it could be somewhere in the letter here. But knowing these fields and how they should be interpreted means that we can be confident that if we want a particular addressee, then we search in the name field. If we want a particular city, then we search in that field, and so on. So this is the XML document that describes our letter, but the structure of the document, how the different parts are represented, related, is provided by this document type definition. So that tells us for instance, that these are all character data fields, but it also tells us that a letter consists of a header and a text, and the header consists of a name and address, and an address includes the street and city. So you see that it provides all that sort of structure. So what's the relationship of this to XML? It means that, this to metadata. It means that if we represent our metadata in XML, then we can just include whatever fields we want in a particular application. We can flexibly define the type of the data and the size of the data. Hopefully the different applications can include the fields that they need but still maintain a common format. So here's a movie example of a particular movie, Gattaca. Anyone familiar with Gattaca? Cool movie if you ever have a chance, even if it's a bit old. But you can see here that the movie is described in this structured way. So we have the title here, we have the year of production up there, we have the content type. So at the highest level, we know that it is actually a movie and not I don't know, documentary or a piece of music. And then within the persons field, we have a number of different players, but note that some of them have an actor role, but another might have a director role. And then we have the capability to include some unstructured text in a synopsis. We can make that as long or short as we want. It's good that this is here. This is saying that in a video on demand system, this movie, because of the rights that I've negotiated, has a particular availability start time, so you can make it available from on your movie on demand service from this date until this date. Right? So we can have automated systems that interpret all that and respond accordingly. So there, you might not be surprised to see MPEG pop up again. Wherever there are standards associated with multimedia, MPEG seems to be there. However, this metadata space is a bit different to what we have seen before. But the story with MPEG was that I always saw their role as facilitating the exchange and trade of multimedia content. So having worked on the audio-visual compression systems in MPEG-1 and MPEG-2 and MPEG-4, they then stood back and asked themselves the question: well, what are still the barriers to free and easy trading and commercialization of content? Well, maybe people are struggling to actually find the content that they want, so we need a metadata solution. And there are all these ones out there, but no one's come up with a good unifying solution. So they developed MPEG-7. Why 7? I think I might have already talked to you about this. It was literally that having produced the standards MPEG-1, MPEG-2 and MPEG-4, they thought, well, everyone else is going to guess that the next one's going to be 8, so let's do the unpredictable, and so we'll make it 7. No better reason. So MPEG-7 has the formal title Multimedia Content Description Interface, and it tries to use an XML-based representation to describe or represent metadata at a range of different levels, everything from low-level signal characteristics to a high-level typed description of what the content is in. They tried to be generic and not targeted to a specific application, and they standardized the description, but not how you extract the features that it might represent. So they will provide the tools to allow you, for instance, to try to match descriptors of different content without telling you how to actually extract them. So it doesn't tell you how to recognize faces, but it tells you how to describe them and match them. So I said it's based on XML, but it does have some extensions, and it has extensions because XML was not developed with audio-visual content in mind. So time-related concepts like durations and what the time points are that delineate different shots in a movie. So you have a particular scene that might last a few seconds before you change to a different camera angle. All that sort of stuff has been added. So I don't want to get too distracted by the details of what's in MPEG 7, but just a bit of an overview of what it provides. So there are a set of descriptors that allow you to represent the features in the multimedia. And the relationship between those components. So I think there's a graphic that will illustrate that in just a second. And they've introduced specific tools for description of video and audio. So to be able to describe an audio spectrogram, so a spectrogram is, as the name suggests, a representation of the main frequency components in the audio, or to be able to describe facial features for face recognition and these sorts of things needed to be added because no one had defined them before. And there's also a language that they developed to allow the definition of new descriptors, again trying to make the solution as future-proof as possible. And also, consistent with what MPEG had done before, they haven't just done the description of the metadata, but they've provided the systems tools which take it all the way down to a bit level. Right? So there are ways to, they define ways to actually encode all this information as well. So this is the graphic that kind of shows that relationship. So these are the descriptors. This is the one of these could be used to describe an image. One of them could be used to describe subtitling text. One of them could be used to describe audio or video. But then there's this structured relationship between them all, such as that there's a description scheme might be showing that a movie might be composed of a video and an audio channel and associated with subtitling, and then the video channel might have multiple components that are tacked together to make it, and so on. And then for a particular instantiation, a particular movie, for instance, then we'll have all the details in these XML fields, and then there's the description of how you encode and deliver all of that content. So here's a possibly unreadable example of MPEG 7 XML, and don't worry about. I have no expectation that you'd be interpreting any of this or that we understand all of it, but I just wanted to give you a feel for the sorts of things that it provides with metadata. So, for instance, we have what have we got? Some color descriptors here of with histograms of. Here's a histogram of edge directions, for instance, that are specified. I presume that it's recognizing edges in particular directions, and so we have a histogram of how much content of the particular image has edges in particular directions. Or here we have descriptors of texture, energy in different frequency bands, maybe, measurements of color variance. So these are the sort of things that we can use to characterize our image, a bit like your question about matching different content. And then you can use that to identify a piece of content from these descriptors, or to identify similar types of content, and so on. Okay, so the second major part of what I wanted to talk about tonight is digital rights management. So, and there are multiple components of digital rights management. And digital rights management is all about piracy, or competing, or trying to combat it, sorry. So let's talk about what the piracy problem is, although I'm sure you have a pretty good feel for it from just general knowledge. So the delivery chain of multimedia content, in theory, looks like this. We start with the content creators. Think of the TV, the film studio. The film studio isn't involved in distribution, although I seem to remember hearing something in the press recently about Disney starting a movies on demand service or a streaming service or something directly. Anyway, ordinarily the content creator would pass their content onto a video on demand service such as a Netflix or iTunes or similar. The video on demand service may run their own content delivery network, or they might contract to some other provider such as Akamai with their CDNs, or I mentioned Telstra runs a CDN here, for instance. And so with the CDN and the network provision, we eventually deliver to the consumer. The consumer, of course, is the one who's supposed to provide all the provide the funding for this in the end, because they're the ones who are seeking to view this content, hopefully. So the money flows back the other way. And so some of what the consumer pays goes to the delivery provider, goes to the service provider, and eventually gets back to the content creator. But of course the whole model breaks down when there's some other path that this movie takes and finds its way to the consumer. So if it's pirated, basically. So then the money dries up and the model doesn't work. These guys don't have a business model anymore. The content can't be created. So what's the perspective of these guys? Well, the content creator says, you know, I can't produce movies or music or books or whatever if I don't get paid for it. The service provider has the perspective that they're invested in the content and they provide the infrastructure to sell it. They handle all the transactions, and they need to get a return on that investment. The delivery platform has a similar perspective, and they need to be funded, of course. They need to get their return on their investment, but also so they're under pressure to make their platform as secure as possible. So the response to all this has been to try, with various degrees of success, to provide what's called content protection over that whole delivery chain. So to try to combat this, so it's not it's more difficult to pirate content and get it to the other end without payment. But it's problematic because from the consumer's point of view, there can be some difficulties or some inconveniences. So, for instance, does this content protection thing mean that I've got to pay for the same content that I deliver, that I receive in different formats? You know, if I bought the movie on DVD, why do I have to pay for it because I want to stream it to my tablet? Or you know, am I paying for all of this infrastructure for content protection when I'm not the one who steals the movie? So you know, why am I paying some sort of a premium? And if this content protection thing keeps an eye on exactly what you're doing, does that mean it's monitoring what all my viewing choices? I'm not necessarily comfortable with that happening. So digital rights management is a solution that is somewhat controversial. Okay, so let's look at where the main sources of this piracy are. And to investigate that or to understand that, we need to look at where the content makes its money. And we'll use movies as an example because I happen to have a reasonably good source, a textbook that discussed securing digital video. But even though it's relatively recent, 2012, in terms of textbook dates, that isn't so long ago. But I don't know if Netflix was even running in 7 years ago. But so the amounts that are mentioned here about what percentage of the funds comes from different delivery choices might be a bit out of date, but it still gives us a feel for what's going on. So this varies a lot from one movie to another, but here are some sort of typical figures, which are somewhat surprising. So the initial cinema release might typically give only about 25% of the total revenue to the movie company. They get a little bit from airlines and hotels, who are the next ones to have the movie available, typically 2 to 4 months after cinema release. Then the bulk of the revenue comes from home video and rental, or at the time DVD or Blu-ray rental. Then there's a little bit for pay-per-view and VOD. This, as I was suggesting, is no doubt much greater, but at the expense of this one, so there'll be a shift over here. And then we go on to the TV services, pay TV and the free-to-air networks. So the movie's been around for quite a long time by the time it gets to the free-to-air networks, where it's relatively easy to copy, of course, as well. The bulk of the revenue comes from this initial release to the home market. So over time, the content, the movie in this case, has become increasingly available. That's not intended to be mapped against this axis. It's just saying, availability is increasing over time. And as any commodity becomes increasingly available, its value decreases. Right? If it's easier to get a copy, then it's worth less in general terms. So what that's telling us is that it's right up at the front here where there's the greatest value if you're considering pirating a movie. And the movie producers are going to want to restrict access, particularly up this at the front end, to ensure that they receive the revenue from their production. So how are movies actually stolen? Well, the earliest opportunity to get a pirated copy of a movie is that it sometimes leaks from post-production companies. So there are lots of specialized companies that do just one little part of a movie production or a television series production. So they might just do the dubbing, or they might just do the captioning. So they get a copy of it, and there's a risk that someone working in one of those companies might make a copy and distribute it on the net or whatever. When the movie is completed, it's sometimes delivered to Academy Award judges, and they get it early. They get what's called a screener, an awards screener, and sometimes they leak for one reason or another. This is all before the cinema release, or could be before the cinema release. Once it's released in the cinemas, it's possible that someone could steal a film print, at least if it was on film format. These days it's on digital, in digital form. We'll talk about digital cinema towards the end of the semester. But the film print's delivered to the cinema, and then you've got one of the, a projection, anyway, from a projectionist to a cleaner maybe, I don't know, might be able to get their hands on it and make a copy. Even when it's being projected in the cinema, you're probably aware that sometimes there are camcorder recordings. Sometimes it's during a regular screening, so you've got the sounds of people scrunching their lolly papers next to you, or people, silhouette of someone getting up and going out to the toilet. But anyway, higher quality ones come from some complicity between the projectionist and their friend. So they do a screening at 2 in the morning, and the friend sets up their camcorder, has a good quality audio and uninterrupted view per good position. Once the DVDs start being produced, they can be leaked from somewhere in the manufacture and distribution process. And even when it's released, of course, it's possible to rip the original DVD. And finally, you could record from a TV broadcast. But that stuff, this is a very small scale that people would do for family and friends, and that's called ant-piracy, because it's small scale stuff. So that's not what the movie production houses are really concerned about. I mean, they might make a big noise in the press about people ripping DVDs instead of buying them, but these days, DVDs are out of date anyway. But what's really of concern to them is further up this chain, and that's because we have this increasing availability as we go down and increasing value as we go up. So here's an interesting case study. I thought it was worth relating this. I don't know if you're familiar with the first of the latest series of Star Trek movies, but the Star Trek movie was came out in 2009. Had simultaneous release in several countries on the 6th of May 2009, so actually almost on a birthday. Its official release was 8th of May, but the first bootleg DVD hit the street on the same day, 8th of May, because it had been captured at a cinema in one of the pre-release screenings. So there were several other camcorder captures that were distributed from different countries. One of them in particular was of particularly good quality. So the Ukrainian copy was the reference copy, and by the end of August that year, so May to August, 5 million IP addresses had downloaded it from peer-to-peer sites, and many other people may have got it from other sources. But they're the addresses that were monitored. And just by comparison, 35 million people had actually paid to watch the movie. So it's not necessarily valid, I don't think, but the film producers probably say, well, that's 5 million tickets that we missed out on. They would value the piracy at that, 5 million times $20 or whatever. But surely there'd be a lot of those people who, if they had no other choice, they probably wouldn't pay the $20 anyway. It just shows this kind of order of magnitude that the number of people who pirated the movie was at least comparable with those that actually paid for it. So that's the perspective from the film producers and the driver for looking at copyright protection systems. A little bit of a summary of why they're necessary, but I think we probably understand that pretty well. Historically, of course, it's been relatively difficult to copy analog content. You might say, well, hang on, it's really easy to set up a DVD player, a VCR recorder or something, but you could only make a copy if you did it in real time, and you could only make one copy at a time. And there was degradation in every copy that you made. So yes, technically the process of making one copy from another was not difficult. It wasn't anywhere near as easy as it is with modern digital formats, where we can just drag and drop and email to a distribution list or put them on a server, and any number of people can extract them from a server or a peer-to-peer platform. And as a result, it's this effective protection of intellectual property rights, or copyright, if you like, remains a major impediment to content availability. So finally, well, not finally, but now we've got around to answering this question about what is DRM. So digital rights management is this general term that encompasses these efforts to protect against piracy. So how do we compete against piracy? Does content encryption solve the problem? Right? So if we take some original content and we encrypt it before we distribute it, and then we decrypt it for a playback, does that solve our problem? No, because yeah, we've decrypted it here, and so we've got the original content in the clear. So yes, we've protected against someone sniffing the line here somewhere.
As a database, you might give it something.
Exactly, but we've got back an original copy. So so by itself, encryption isn't going to solve the problem. So this is my description of why encryption doesn't solve the problem. The traditional cryptography problem is one where we try to make sure the good guys get the message but the bad guys don't. So if I can use the Star Wars analogy, Princess Leia wants to send her message to Obi-Wan Kenobi, I think I've got my characters right, and wants to make sure that Darth Vader doesn't get the message. That's the traditional cryptography problem. But the DRM problem is a little bit different because we don't necessarily trust the good guy. There's a little bit of Darth Vader in every Obi-Wan Kenobi. So Princess Leia gets the message to the person that she wants, but she doesn't necessarily trust him, what he does with the message. So so that's why the problem is different. We're giving a copy to someone to watch, but now that they've got it, what are they going to do with it? So how does DRM fix the problem? It uses a number of different measures. The first one is to try to control access to the content in the first place. The second is to use encryption not just to deliver to an authorized user, but also to apply technical constraints around what they can do. So we try to permit consumption but not copying, and that's a tricky problem. And then in the end, because it's still going to leak out somewhere, no solution like this is going to be ideal, then we try to detect these unauthorized copies and prosecuting those responsible by trying to match the content. And this is the sort of thing that we talked about earlier with regard to this fingerprinting. And the reason that this content is going to leak out anyway, if for no other reason, even if we can't get around the barriers here, we always have this thing called the analog hole. Because if it's multimedia content we're talking about, at some stage the image is going to be visible on the screen, such as in the cinema, or the audio is going to be played out of some speakers, so we can always record it. It's always going to be possible to record it. So we need some component here. So if we think of a flow of a piece of multimedia content from a server to a consumer, and the possibility that they may further distribute this content, then the functions of DRM can be illustrated this way. First of all, sorry about the formatting, but we want to control access to the server in the first place to only those who are authorized. So we authenticate our users, we encrypt access, we only allow access if the person is authorized. Authorized means they paid their money, of course. We then control usage, so we might put limits on what the consumer can do, such as to the extent that the device can support it, we might put restrictions on no copying or only being able to play for a certain period of time, or maybe a limited number of times. And then we include content tracking to detect these copies should they appear on the larger network. Not only can we detect copies that exist, but there are technologies that allow us to trace where they've come from. So, what solutions are there to carry out these processes? Control access to the content, control usage, identify the content, and track the path it's taken. Let's go through each of them in turn. So, access control is based on encrypting the content, and so only key holders can access it. And that forces access to be controlled by the DRM system. So we use an encryption key to encrypt the content, and no matter what happens to that content, as long as it's securely encrypted, and strong encryption systems can be are easily achieved today. It's not very, it's a well-known technology to make encryption systems very strong. It means that if this person wants to make a copy of this thing that's been delivered to them, we deliver the encrypted content to a legitimate user. If we can keep it encrypted, then we don't really care if they distribute it to lots of their friends, because these friends can only access that content if they come back and negotiate for the key and pay for it. So the sort of process, pay TV conditional access systems are an example, and we're actually going to spend a session talking about digital TV, so we'll talk about how they do that conditional access then. But that's essentially this process where pay TV content is encrypted, and by management of keys that are stuck in the front of a set-top box in the receiver, we're able to restrict the users to only those who are authorised. For a typical on-demand content, the sort of flow and the processes that are involved are illustrated on this slide. So the obvious content flow is from the content provider to the distributor to the consumer, but there are other functions that are added onto this because of the digital rights management and the access control. So first of all, the content is provided or is distributed or is provided to the distributor. There are payment conditions associated with that content, and that may well have been specified within the metadata, so the whole thing can be automated. So there's this financial clearinghouse that will restrict delivery until payment has been confirmed. So when the consumer is at the point where they want to obtain access to the content, they'll identify, or the user has to be identified, the device has to be recognised, and the content is requested. Payment has to be made before the financial clearinghouse says, yes, okay, you can authorise delivery. So the rights that this person has purchased for access to the content are made available to the distributor. Only at that point is the protected content delivered, along with the license, which defines what can be done. And what did I miss? Oh yes, the money needs to flow back to the content provider as well. And then there's this usage clearinghouse here that tracks the information, just so that these guys know who has used, or at least in a statistical sense, how many people are using the content, and maybe even how they're consuming it. Are they watching it all the way through, or are they stopping early, and so on. So how do we actually control the usage inside the consumer's device? We need to determine that. Oh, sorry, how do we specify, rather, these limits on use? We need to confirm that these conditions have been met, so we need to determine that the user is who they say they are. We need to deliver to a device that has a secure measurement of time. For instance, if we say that the iTunes movie can only be played for 48 hours, then the clock inside the device has to be reliable, can't be just set back. We need to make sure that there's some mechanism to bind those access rules to the content and they can't be manipulated. And we need to specify those the usage rights in some way. There's actually a rights expression language that will be used. And we've talked about XML as being a way of structuring the description of the content. There's also a language that will be used to define the access rights, to define things like how many times you can play a piece of content, what the beginning date is that you're allowed to access it, the expiration date that you're allowed to access it. You see this item here, on clock rollback, then delete, right? So if there's a detection that the clock in the device has been set back to try to gain extra time here, then we'll automatically delete it. We also need to use a consumer device that is tamper-proof in some way, and this is has varying degrees of difficulty. If it's a closed hardware system, a purpose-built box, then it has trusted software in there. It's not really programmable. It's not very easy for you to get inside an Apple TV box, for instance, and try to circumvent the DRM system. Or an e-book reader is another example that it's not, I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it's very difficult to get inside there and hack it. But a PC is much more flexible in terms of what you can do, but there are software analogues of these closed hardware systems where the various software components encrypt data that they exchange with one another, and they are also very difficult to hack. So I mentioned this rights expression language, and that's an opportunity to introduce yet another MPEG standard. This is, I should have mentioned, by the way, that MPEG 7, though it's an attempt to unify and standardize the exchange of metadata, has not been embraced by the industry by any means. There are some people who see it as just too complex, and so it hasn't been universally adopted in the same way that something like H.264 or H.265 or the audio AAC has. But nevertheless, it still remains pretty much the only attempt to provide universal, a uniform standard metadata description. So the MPEG 21, what's that all about? That's I could tell exactly the same story again. MPEG committee got back together and said, okay, we've done the metadata now, what else do we need? So they decided that some sort of a complete environment for, or definition of a complete environment for exchange and trade of multimedia was what was required. So, can we standardize ways of exchanging data with for financial transactions, or I think we'll actually have a slide, maybe not tonight, but on another day, where we look at a little bit more about MPEG 21. But one of the components that they felt was missing was a standardized definition of this rights expression language. So we had a standardized definition of the metadata, but not how you could define the rights that someone would have if they negotiated access to it. So so that was one of the components of this XML. So the idea of a rights expression language is that essentially summarised here. So a certain issuer, so the owner of the content, grants a right to access a particular resource and under certain conditions. So the resource is the multimedia content. The conditions are, you can access it during this range of dates, and the right is what you can do with it. You can play it, but you can't copy it. These sorts of things. So a very simple example here: the license grants Alice here the right to play this content, this resource, with those conditions that it only is in this particular date. Okay, so how do we try to prevent copying in the in this trusted hardware or software environment that I mentioned just a moment ago? This would be the flow of or the block diagram for delivery of multimedia content if it wasn't for DRM. Sorry, losing my voice. This is probably charged a little bit, so I might turn it on. And the flow is really quite straightforward. We just have a media storage server. We talked a bit about servers last time. That stream of data would just be delivered to the client, where we would recognize the content and the metadata. The metadata would help us to decode and display the content. It would tell us what it was all about, give us details of the actor and all that sort of stuff if we wanted it, and then we would just decode and render the video and present it on a screen and present the audio to the speakers. But the inclusion of DRM makes life somewhat more complicated. So everything in black there is secure and encrypted exchanges. So now, instead of just getting a copy of the content, it's an encrypted copy of the content. The content and the metadata, or the essence and the metadata, are encrypted and bound together, so we can never separate them. We never have visibility of them separate, so we can't get in and try to mess about with the metadata. There's this controller block here, the DRM controller, at the center here, that's managing all of this. Sorry about the text wrapping. And as well as having the flow of decoded data through this rendering application and showing it, we're going to permit this only if these rights are satisfied. So they're things like identity. Is this the person that they say they are? Is the playback within the dates that are allowed, and this sort of thing? And this manages the keys that are used for the decryption. So it means that instead of just grabbing a piece of content via a URL, decoding and displaying it, instead we have to negotiate with a license generator. We pay, we confirm that the transaction has been complete before we provide the rights and the keys for this content that the DRM controller can access, and that allows it to decrypt the it allows us to take the content, decrypt it in a secure way, and then deliver it over a secure link. So this might be HDMI, so we're all familiar with that, connecting our TVs to our Apple TV boxes or something similar. But there's a standard encryption method that's used over HDMI, so you can't even get access to the digital bit stream in the clear. Okay, so how are we going for time? Okay, I think we will finish on time. I mentioned early on in response to Tristan's question about fingerprinting. So fingerprinting is used to uniquely identify a piece of content based on what's in it, rather than something that's associated with it, like a tag on the side. So it's also called perceptual hashing. So because it has the same function, we take this big chunk of data, say a movie of multiple gigabytes, and we try to reduce it to a single, relatively short, unique descriptor. So can we come up with a number, a relatively short number that is pretty much unique to that piece of content? The most obvious things we might do is, directly comparing with the digital waveform, we could come up with a hash or some sort of a CRC based on the digital data. That would be unique to the piece of content. It would be useful if we wanted to identify if there are any errors in it, but it wouldn't necessarily help us to identify that content, particularly if someone wanted to attack it, right? Because you just change a few bits and your CRC is wrong, so you no longer identify that 5 gigabyte file as being your movie. So those sorts of hashing approaches are inefficient and ineffective. So minor changes to the bitstream would destroy any ability to match. So ideally, we would like it to be our fingerprinting approach should be robust to processing. So if someone takes a piece of content, movie or music or something, and re-encodes it using a different coding scheme or at a different rate, or if they resample it, if they go into the analog domain and back into the digital domain, if noise is added, if they change the format, then we should still be able to identify the piece of content if we can. So what we want to concentrate on is perceptually significant features. So points where there are high signal power, points where there are time-dependent changes. So some examples are listed here. In music, and this is what Shazam uses, we can try to identify throughout the piece of music which are the highest peaks of the audio spectrum in terms of power at a particular frequency, and what's the relationship between them. So if anyone destroys that, they're pretty much destroying the music as well. In the video case, we can do things like the shot boundaries. I referred to this briefly earlier. So if we've got a list of the times at which the scene changes throughout a movie, then if you've even if someone was trying to hide the fact that this copy was that particular movie, it would be hard to change that set of shot boundaries without destroying the movie. Right? You could change the you could reduce the resolution. So from a 4K original, you could reduce it down to a couple of hundred pixels by a couple of hundred pixels, if you like. You could compress it very heavily. You could even change the average intensity, brightness, this sort of thing. But if you change the timing of the scene changes, then you're really upsetting the movie. You're playing it at a different speed or something, I'm not sure. And there are also possibilities for images. So to characterize an image by the histogram of the pixel values in some sense, or characterize it from the low spatial frequencies, because we know we'll get rid of the high spatial frequencies by compression. So this sort of fingerprinting is an important technology that's used in multimedia, and it's not always used for DRM, right? Shazam was the example where you fingerprint a music track and compare it with your database, and the purpose is not to detect piracy, but rather just to match it so that you can then go and buy it. But in the DRM application, it also can be used. So we can crawl websites and check the fingerprint to try to find copyrighted content, or we can do these things like we were talking about earlier, blocking uploading of copyrighted content. So Facebook will block you if you try to upload something that's copyright. But for for which you don't have the copyright. And here's the examples of other non-DRM applications. So I mentioned Shazam, pulling up the metadata, so getting the track titles from iTunes when you import a piece of music. This is a little bit off topic, but just to explain what I'm meaning here. If you paid for an advertisement to be broadcast on a TV, say paid free-to-air TV, how do you know that it was broadcast? You're going to pay someone to watch it at the contracted time and just confirm that your ad was shown and that it was the full 32 seconds or whatever it is. Well, if we can fingerprint it, if we can identify the ad, then we can have an automated system that can track that sort of thing. You might want to use this fingerprinting technique to deduplicate. So if you've got a big database of lots of images, you can check to see if you can find where there are multiple copies. This one, we'll actually talk about this when we talk about how Netflix in particular is an example that does this. If you want to do a lot of encoding of video, and Netflix is an example where someone who wants to do a lot of encoding of video, then to accelerate the process, you can chop your movie up into segments, send them off to different devices to be encoded, then pull them all back together and put them back in sequence. And this fingerprinting is a way of checking that that process was successful, right? Because if you've got the segments out of order, then the fingerprint is destroyed. Here's an example of how you could fingerprint an image. It's just almost a random example. It's just wanted to illustrate something that you could use to reduce an image to a small set of numbers as a fingerprint. So the idea here is that we take an image, any image, we just any resolution, and we chop it up into 4x4 blocks, so 16 blocks, and we find the average intensity of each of them, and then we simply order them according to the lowest average intensity to the next, to the next, and so on. We just order them, and then that set of numbers becomes your fingerprint. Right? So there are lots and lots of different combinations, possible ordering of those 16 numbers, and it might not necessarily uniquely identify a particular image, but it might be a reasonable indicator that another image that has exactly the same order of average intensities in these 16 blocks might well be the same image. So that might be something you want to use when you're trying to deduplicate, for instance. So that was fingerprinting. Now there's another technology which is called watermarking. So fingerprinting will allow you to detect or match a piece of multimedia content. So you can tell that there is a pirated version of your movie that's out there being distributed by Pirate Bay or something. I don't know. But that's all very well. Good to know that it's there, but it would be even better if you could tell how it got there. So while fingerprinting allows us to uniquely identify a piece of content, with watermarking we can embed some information inside the content to identify what the source was. So we can use it to identify the content, but we can also identify a specific copy or a specific source of it. And so that means, and we can also use this to prove or discover ownership. So if I put in my unique watermark, we'll talk about what this watermark is in a moment, but it's a bit of data that's added normally invisibly to the content. if I put in my unique watership, then watermark, then even though my video of Ayers Rock might look similar to your video of Ayers Rock, the watermark in it will prove ownership. We can also include other additional information in this watermark. So potentially we could even include a caption so that it could be associated with the video even if the metadata was lost or stripped off. And interestingly, we can use this watermarking in a kind of reverse way. So here we'd want the watermark to be very robust, so that even if someone recoded the video, reduced the bitrate, resampled it, then we'd still be able to detect ownership. But suppose we just wanted to find out if someone had tampered with a piece of video or an image, then we could put the watermark in. We know that the image, video, audio that we're testing originally had the watermark. But if we can't read the watermark, then we know that someone has tampered with it. So watermarking may be visible or invisible. We're all pretty familiar with visible watermarks. So on the TV broadcasts these days, we have this watermark that identifies the channel. If you go to a photo library that you can buy stock photos from, they normally put a visible watermark over the top of it so that it's not usable unless you pay for the money. But the more interesting ones are the invisible watermarks, at least interesting from the technical point of view. So the idea is that we embed a message somehow in our multimedia content such that it's imperceptible. It's imperceptible, but it's robust. So normally robust. There was that anti-tampering application where you actually want it to be fragile, but in the DRM application you want the watermark to be robust so that even after processing and recoding and compression and so on, you can still read that watermark. Usually the watermark is machine readable, so you just set this machine going and it will try to extract the watermark and confirm ownership or identity. It needs to contain sufficient information for the application. By that I mean it depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to include that caption, then you need quite a lot of information. If you just want to identify the owner of a piece of content, then maybe there's a very small amount of data that you need to include. So I mentioned what robust actually means. It means it's resilient to all of these changes. And we actually are trying to achieve three things by inserting watermarks. And it's hard to get that balance right, but it is a balance between these three. And if we allow, well, it's easy to achieve one, but to get the balance across all three is difficult. So, for instance, if we want to make the watermark very robust, we're essentially putting a strong signal, embedding a strong signal inside our content, which might mean that it's starting to become perceptible. Or if we want to avoid the viewers seeing this noise or whatever the watermark starts to appear like, then maybe we need to only include a small amount of data, which means that our capacity is compromised and so on. So the basic approach to including a watermark is similar for the different media, image, video, audio. The sort of methods that are included are to manipulate the least significant bit. So if we're using 8-bit imaging, for instance, we can subtly change the least significant bit in such a way that over time we've embedded a particular particular bit of digital data, or we could manipulate the high frequency transform coefficients, which aren't so visible, or we could use spread spectrum types of techniques to try to hide the fact that there's a message included in the image or the video. The main challenge is, of course, that we want to embed the watermark where it's not perceptible, so we don't want it to be visible, but it's exactly these non-perceptible parts of the signal that we eliminate when we do compression. Right? So if we try to hide our data by manipulating the high frequency transform coefficients, they're exactly the ones that we discard when we want to compress the image or the audio more. So so this is it's a challenge to manage these conflicting requirements. How do we get increased robustness? Well, we can use very, very heavy error protection coding. So we have a very low bit rate of actual watermark, but we send lots of error protection bits. So when we get enough data, we're able to recover even when the signal is compressed and geometrically manipulated and so on. So there are other non-DRM applications of invisible watermarks, as there were other non-DRM applications for fingerprinting. So if we, again, if we wanted to do things like the auditing of broadcasts and advertisement inclusions, we could embed a watermark and read it. Or we could deliberately make the watermark fragile as a way of checking that that an image hasn't been tampered with. So this is just an example of a particular watermarking system, a company that offers an image-based watermarking approach, just to illustrate the process. So the idea is that the watermark is embedded into this original document in such a way that it's not visible, but it has such strength, such robustness due to error correction techniques that you could print it out, you could scan it or photograph it, and even crop it, and you'd still be able to extract from the segments of the picture the original watermark. I'm not going to show this now, but just if you're interested, there's a particular company, Verimatrix, and I had set this up, but I haven't got time to show it. Just in your leisure, if you're interested, you don't need to, it's not examinable, but there's a bit of a description of their particular technique, and it shows how robust it can be for the case where you take an original, very high quality video, but you compress it down to much lower rates and so on. They're still able to read their watermark. How do you enforce the your digital rights management system using the watermark? Well, because you're embedding a bit of data into this multimedia content, you can embed a different bit of data depending on the particular delivery channel. So in the cinema, for instance, as I mentioned, we'll look at digital cinema a little later, but if at the cinema you embed an invisible watermark that can identify which cinema it is and which session time it is, then if we went through that scenario with Star Trek, where the Ukrainian showing in the cinema was video recorded and became a pirate copy, then you could look inside there and see exactly which session it was and which cinema it was, and then go after the owner and hopefully track down exactly how it was recorded. And in fact, there are methods that analyse the recording, and by the geometric distortion and the differential delays of the sound, they can even identify to within a couple of seats where in the cinema the recording was made. So,
I think you kind of answered my question, but I was going to ask, is it possible to create like a user-specific watermark, like an IP address or something?
Yes, there is. It is. In fact, perfect timing. There are solutions that, if you subscribe to a pay TV system, for instance, then within the set-top box, it inserts a client-specific watermark. So when you think you're being very clever and you record the movie and then you sell it to someone down at the market on a DVD or something, and the content owner discovers it, they can identify exactly the set-top box from which it was played and when the recording was made. In fact, I think that Verimatrix company I mentioned on the previous slide has a solution to do just this. There are other things that can be done. You can kind of forensically analyse a copy. It's possible to determine whether a copy came from a camcorder or ripping a disc by looking at certain characteristics of the recording, things like the frame rate relationship, the colour. You can identify where double compression has been performed, and this geometrical distortion in the case of the camcorder. But, and we're coming close to the end. DRM is highly controversial, as I mentioned early on, because it's essentially comes from the point of view of the assumption that the consumer is trying to defeat it, and so it's putting constraints on consumers or clients or customers, even when they are simply wanting to do the right thing and pay for their content. And so the content consumer would never choose to have DRM because it only restricts what they can do, and it might even be completely legitimate, such as watching a piece of content that they've paid for, just watching it on a different device or at a different time, or watch it while they're on a plane and not connected to a network or something like that. Most DRM systems are proprietary, and they tend to lock you into particular manufacturers' equipment. So, of course, sort of examples are, can you get iTunes content on non-Apple devices? I'm not sure. You can, can't you? You can play it on a PC, get an iTunes app.
I think iTunes you can, but Apple Music you can't.
But what?
Apple Music.
Apple Music you can't. Oh, okay. So that's the sort of restriction that can end up happening. And there have been all sorts of problems with the laws law often struggles to keep up with particularly technological developments. So it can be illegal to circumvent a DRM system, even if it's to do something legal, right? So if you're, what's an example of that? Like it might be legal to watch a piece of content that you've paid for, but on a different device. But if in doing that you actually circumvent the DRM system, then you're committing a crime, at least commonly in some countries. And it's also illegal to distribute information about weaknesses in a DRM system. So there have been examples. I don't know if it's listed here. Oh yes, they. Oh yeah, I've got an example in just a moment of these sorts of problems. Unintentionally, DRM systems and the legal processes around them have increased the vulnerability of some systems. So DRM tries to hide certain processes running in your device because they don't want you to hack them, but that's exactly what virus writers also would like to do. And DRM vulnerabilities can be slow to be patched because of this problem. If you're not allowed to tell people that there's a weakness in a DRM system, then they're not going to know about it, they're not going to patch it. So I don't know if you read anything about or have heard anything about this famous Sony rootkit thing, when you were still in school, I suppose. But anyway, Sony had this brilliant idea. Someone in Sony had this brilliant idea to distribute audio CDs, which, if they're inserted into a PC, they actually change the operating system such that any file starting like this couldn't be seen. So that was a brilliant idea, because virus writers thought that's great. We'll just change our programs to also start with the same name. And apparently, from what I've read, some security organisations knew that this was going to be a problem, but because of this, they felt they couldn't publish the fact that that was going to be an issue. So DRM is problematic. There was another example where DRM was a problem, also about 10 years ago now, or more. Microsoft used to run a music downloading service, like iTunes, but they came to a point where they decided, no, we're not making enough money out of this, we'll get out of the business. But all of the content, all of the music was DRM protected, it was all encrypted. And so they had to announce, as is summarised here if you want to read through it, they had to announce, okay, all the music that you've bought you can continue to use, but as soon as you change your PC, you're not going to have access to it anymore. So people who invested quite a lot into their music libraries were not very happy. And the last point I wanted to make is just that the fact that there are so many DRMs, and there are many proprietary solutions. Don't worry about reading through all the details now, you can have a look later. But depending on the particular platform we're talking about, and even depending on the application you're using, whether it's a browser or a native app, or whether it's an Android or a WinPhone and so on, there are different applicable DRM solutions. Some of them will work across devices, some of them won't, some of them are specific to these devices. And so there's a real problem of interworking between these different DRM solutions. Okay, I'm done for the night. I reckon you probably are as well. So thanks for your efforts on that test, and glad that we were able to get through that topic. And I will mark these tests before next week and continue to talk to you about your projects, which I think are due the end of next week, if I remember correctly, but I'll check that and I'll put a reminder up. Okay, thanks. Let's finish for tonight.